The last topic is on the value of indigenous knowledge systems to counseling psychology and even to religious education. Looking at the value of indigenous knowledge to counseling psychology and to indigenous and to religious studies and theology, we consider first counseling psychology, its importance to counseling psychology. First, IKS are an invaluable to counseling psychology by offering, or it offers, culturally grounded, holistic approaches that prioritize community, spirituality, and rant, moving beyond Western models of counseling psychology or counseling in general to address diverse client needs, foster true belonging, and facilitate deep healing, especially for trauma, through practices like storytelling, elder guidance, and integrating physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. They provide culturally relevant frameworks, enhance client trust, and ensure interventions that resonate deeply within a client's cultural context, promoting resilience and decolonizing mental health practices. Take, for example, holistic healing, another one, cultural relevance and belonging, that community and family focus, another one, spiritual connection, another one, land-based practices, another one, another value, just noted in summary, storytelling and oral traditions, another one, another value, decolonizing practice. You may talk of holistic healing and argue that IKS views well-being as interconnected, that is physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, addressing the whole person, not just symptoms, which Western models often miss. The other one I've noted is cultural relevance and belonging, where we root, or it roots therapy in indigenous contexts, making the client to feel understood, to feel valued, and to feel connected to their heritage, countering the feelings of shame of being the other person, not one of us, but the other person. Another value we have just mentioned is community and family focus. Community and family focus. I can emphasize by saying that the value of IKS in counseling is seen in its emphasis on corrective healing, family support, clan structures like councils of elders for socialization, security, and moral guidance. We talked about another value of IKS to counseling psychology is spiritual connection. I can expound. It recognizes spirituality as central to healing, incorporating traditional beliefs, rituals, and myths as core therapeutic elements, not just supplementary assets. The other value we noted is land-based practices. Now, it connects healing to the land, fostering resilience and empowering communities through traditional practices and connection to place. The other one is storytelling and oral traditions. That is, IKS utilizes narratives in its counseling bits, proverbs, and oral histories as powerful tools for exploring experiences, transmitting wisdom, and fostering insight. The other value of IKS in counseling is decolonizing practice. That is, it challenges Eurocentric models, integrating indigenous ways of knowing. You may talk of medicine wheel, and empowers local mental health workers and elders. They are empowered in that way. So there are practical applications that we can give. One is trauma-informed care, which embeds culture into trauma recovery, acknowledging colonization's impact and using culturally grounded methods for healing intergenerational trauma. The other one is the other practical application of indigenous knowledge in counseling is community-led initiatives, which develops mental health systems within communities, involving elders as mentors and training local indigenous workers. The other practical application to indigenous knowledge to counseling is culturally sensitive interventions. That is, it adapts therapeutic techniques to align with specific cultural values, ensuring mutual respect and understanding. By integrating IKS, counseling psychology becomes more comprehensive, more equitable, and effective, particularly for indigenous populations, offering profound insights into human suffering and resilient pathways to wellness. The other thing we will consider is the value of indigenous knowledge systems to theology or religious studies. And I hasten to say that indigenous knowledge systems enrich theology and religious education by offering holistic, community-focused worldviews, promoting ecological stewardship, providing contextualized pastoral care, and decolonizing faith by challenging Eurocentric approaches, thereby fostering culturally relevant spiritual practices and addressing social justice through communal well-being, emphasizing interconnectedness and integrating traditional wisdom with modern faith. We can cite a few examples such as enhanced pastoral care. Understanding of indigenous rituals like rites of passage allows ministers, like in a church, theologians, serving as ministers of religious institutions, to offer culturally sensitive counseling, transforming perceived pagan, the so-called pagan in quotes, into meaningful support for grief or healing. You can talk of now decolonization and say that when we integrate IKS or indigenous knowledge systems, it challenges the dominance of Western thought in theological education or Christian education or religious education, leading to curriculum reform and fostering indigenous voices for theological discourse. Something else is to do with ethical and social frameworks. Now, we say that indigenous values promote communal well-being, sustainable practices, and strong social obligations, offering alternatives to destructive capitalist models and informing public theology and religious education on justice and identity. The other one is, as a value of IKS to theology, is contextualized faith. Now, indigenous knowledge systems offer ways to understand Christian messages within local cultures. For example, the Akan of Ghana, they have done it very well, contextualizing the faith. Yes, they are known for that. They have done well, making faith more relevant through local symbols, oral traditions, and through cultural expressions. Now, we have talked a lot about holistic worldview as a contribution of IKS to theology. That is, indigenous knowledge systems provide frameworks centered on community, ecology, and interconnectedness, contrasting with often individualistic Western theology, enriching concepts like salvation or soteriology, and humanity, that is anthropology. So that's how they enrich. So when you have a good dialogue between, for example, gospel and culture, you end up employing sometimes anthropocentric language that enriches and makes that religion your own religion again. Whether it is a missionary religion, it no longer remains so because of the anthropological touch through anthropomorphism, or using African ones or indigenous ones like goddess father, goddess mother, goddess an elder brother. You make it, look like it's something very close to you. Or using anthropomorphic ones like, of course, we talk of God the Father or the Mother, depending on, I know of Aga of Ghana, who talk of Atanya, Nyonmo, Father, Mother, God. The way they do it in indigenous Akan society, they make it, they enrich those concepts such as, ecclesiology, soteriology, even their bibliology. Everything is enriched through indigenous knowledge systems. So it's no wonder to find people using indigenous melodies, indigenous way of worship, though they are not indigenous religious worshippers. They have converted to another religion, but they are able to know what to embrace, what to adapt, what to engage, and promote it through to the new religion that they have converted into. Now, we can look at some practical applications. You may talk of curriculum, where we integrate indigenous languages. Yeah, you hear of South Africa, where in 2013 they allowed in the University of KwaZulu-Natal, you can even work out, do instruction in Zulu language, and or you can write your thesis in Zulu language. And that is the success of the standards of indigenous knowledge system over the years. Yeah, integrating histories of the indigenous peoples, the philosophy of indigenous peoples, into theological studies. Now, that one builds a new curriculum that is inclusive and relevant and contextual. Another practical example that we can give is community engagement. That is using traditional storytelling, music, and practices for theological formation and spiritual growth. Yes. Yeah, when they hear those indigenous melodies in the new religion that one has converted into, that makes religion look authentic and people start taking it as their own. When they hear some storytelling based on indigenous knowledge or practices that are in tandem with the new converting religion, now that makes a wonderful engagement and dialogue that enriches the new religio-cultural paradigm or trajectory. Another practical example is addressing modern crisis. How can we address modern crisis in theological education or utilizing indigenous knowledge? Now, applying indigenous ecological knowledge, like the Green Belt movement in Kenya, to environmental and social challenges makes it a wonderful progression, and indeed enriches other forms of indigenous or forms of environmental preservation. It's very enriching. Those are some of the things we may want to consider. But again, we need to look at complementary roles of Western versus indigenous. Are they fighting one another? Is indigenous knowledge fighting Western knowledge? Not at all. When we talk about complementary roles, we look at the extent to which each of them builds the other. Because these are creations of God. You don't have knowledge that has taken people across the centuries, maybe I can say without the hand of God. Now, complementary roles between Western and indigenous frameworks involve integrating or blending two distinct, often opposing worldviews to create a more holistic, effective to knowledge, science, and management. Indigenous knowledge is typically characterized as holistic, spiritual, and place-based, focusing on the interconnectedness of all things. In contrast, Western perspectives tend to be scientific, compartmentalized, and analytical. Now, let's take some of the complementary areas that can provide some more practical examples. We can cite quite a number. We can cite quite a number of them, and I can mention the so-called two-eyed seeing, a concept that came from Elder Albert Marshall, I think an Australian indigenous scholar, indigenous knowledge scholar. They call him Micmac Elder Albert Marshall. He came up with a theory of two-eyed seeing, which indeed is a guiding principle developed by Marshall, and it advocates for learning to see from one eye with the strength of indigenous knowledge and from the other with the strength of Western sciences. In turn, Elder Marshall is renowned for introducing the concept of two-eyed seeing They call it Etuapt Munk. Etuapt Munk. That's how they call it, two-eyed seeing in his own language, which frames Western and indigenous knowledge systems as complementary rather than conflicting. His approach emphasizes utilizing the distinct strengths of both worldviews to achieve a more holistic understanding of the world. Elder Marshall is a highly respected elder of his own people from the Moose clan of the Eskasoni First Nation in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, his homeland. He is globally recognized for coining and championing the concept of two-eyed seeing as the designated voice for his people or the elders on environmental issues. And he employs the concept of sustainability that emphasizes the responsibility to care for the earth and all living things. Now, there is something else we may talk about beyond Elder Marshall's two-eyed concept in seeing the Western and indigenous knowledge systems as not in quarrel or as if they are fighting one another, is methodological integration. We can integrate methods of Western and indigenous in order to achieve for the global society. Now, Western science can provide broader data-driven context, for example, satellite, GPS, and remote sensing, while indigenous knowledge offers deep local, longitudinal, and ecological insights. Another thing is to do with environmental management as a complementary role of Western and indigenous. And co-management strategies often involve combining indigenous place-based indicators. For example, animal behavior, plant growth, for example, with scientific plot-based measures for more accurate, sustainable, and adaptive management. And the other complementary role of Western and indigenous knowledge systems is to do with research and knowledge production. We may say that indigenous methodologies are centered on relationality, interconnectedness, and community. And in a complementary model, they are used to guide, to shape, and validate research alongside Western and often quantitative methods, reducing the risk of cognitive imperialism. You know, cognitive imperialism has to do with thinking like a colonized mind, with a colonized mind, or a mind that suffers from self-confidence or believing in oneself, whose attitude, is dictated by other people and feels that's the way we must be told what to do rather than think through. That is cognitive imperialism. So we have to reduce the risk of cognitive imperialism by employing complementarity as a way forward. Chinua Achebe, in his novel Things Fall Apart, talks of hybridity, when people of Omofia in Nigeria are able to embrace both their own ways and the new ways that came with the missionaries and the colonial system, because they found each has something to offer. Their own had something to offer them, and the new ways, though despite being imperialistic, it had some few areas here and there that you needed to embrace. That complementarity offered perfect cognitive people to walk away from cognitive imperialism, or they were able to grow. Of course, there are differences between Western and indigenous, very clear differences. The differences between Western and indigenous worldviews represent a fundamental, often divergent approach to knowledge, nature, time, and community. While Western thought tends to prioritize individualism, empirical science, and linear progress, indigenous perspectives emphasize collectivism, spirituality, and circular, interconnected relationships. The complementary approach. That complementary approach acknowledges that these systems are not always easily merged due to fundamental differences in philosophy. Yeah, because there's truth and perspective. There is relation to land. There is time and knowledge. If you look at truth and perspective, you note that indigenous worldviews often accept multiple truths based on individual experience, whereas Western perspectives seek to identify a single, objective, universal truth. The other one is to do with relating to land, because you note something, indigenous, relational, and sacred. That's how the indigenous people or indigenous knowledge views land, as relational and sacred, while Western often treats land and resources as available for extraction. They are there to be taken. But you see, these people in the indigenous ways are very keen, because this is where land is where ancestors lay buried. And so they become spiritual, it becomes a spiritual concern or a spiritual matter. It's not just for extraction or stealing and making money or making wealth or just growing the economy without spiritual backgrowth. There is a lot to do with land among indigenous knowledge systems. With regard to time and knowledge, indigenous knowledge is often passed orally in a circular, non-linear time frame, where Western knowledge is usually linear, future-oriented, and recorded. The indigenous knowledge is not in a hurry to record it. It's important to see it practiced by the community in their own way of practicing. It's not a question of trying to appear like you have done it. No. It's a question of, is the community involved and working around that? And can everybody understand it and pass it, even if it's orally? Yes, you have seen some indigenous churches I've visited myself, where they tell you, even if you know the song, Nearer My God to Thee, please don't use the golden bells, so that you own it. Yeah, the way indigenous knowledge emphasizes. Just sing it from the heart. Nearer my God to Thee. You can also bring in indigenous tones, melodies, so that it is danced, like the way we dance our songs, the way we sing with a lot of vigor, and our own working emotions, not the emotions in a negative sense. And so indigenizing some of these things makes things look different. So it's not an issue of recording, that's the point I was making. It's an issue of owning it, particularly orally. There are also key differences we have noted, like knowledge and truth, relationship with nature, where land has been taken, time and planning, we have looked at it. Another difference is community and wealth. Yes, where collectivism is prioritized in the indigenous knowledge, where the Western emphasizes individualism, even wealth acquisition. Yes, spirituality and science, this is where spirituality is integrated into aspect of life. And Western tends to separate the spiritual from the secular, often promoting a skeptical, rationalistic worldview. There are also areas of divergence where indigenous and Western seem to deviate when it comes to environmental management, as noted. In terms of education, as noted. In terms of development, if I talk about development, I can say that Western approaches often push for rapid industrial development, which frequently clashes with indigenous sustainable land-based practices. Now, how can we bridge these divergences? How can we bridge them or bridge the gaps? Now, despite these differences, there is increasing interest in combining these worldviews to address complex global challenges. So that complex like two-eyed seeing, coined by Elder Marshall, advocate for using the best of both indigenous and Western ways of knowing. So Elder Marshall comes out as the best person who gives us practical dimension of how we can bridge the gaps. But of course, there are challenges to complementarity. So despite the benefits, bringing these systems together faces challenges that include power imbalances, that include trust and sharing, that includes risk of assimilation. I can start by talking about the risk of assimilation. The danger that Western frameworks may graft or sanitize indigenous knowledge rather than truly respecting it as a co-equal or distinct system or distinct other, and respect its uniqueness. Yes, that is a major challenge. You see, if it's a dialogue, dialogue has to be, cannot be a monologue or one-sided. It has to be two-way. I respect you, you respect me, you listen to me, I listen to you. Now, when we go back to trust and sharing, you note that issues surrounding the sharing of knowledge, particularly when it is considered sensitive, secret, or proprietary by indigenous community. You can also talk about the power imbalances when Western scientific institutions often dominate, relegating indigenous knowledge to a subordinate or tokenized role or something. That itself is power imbalance, and it's dangerous. So if we don't have trust, if we have power issues, if we have issues with sharing, we have the risk of assimilation. These are just challenges to complementarity. We want to complement one another rather than compete or acculturate or destroy one and maintain the other. There is a tendency to employ acculturation in order to destroy one and keep one. Particularly, the Western has always had that challenge, or has always been seen to be assimilative, or acculturative, or enforcing itself on domineering, or sometimes even imperialistic. That is a danger zone, because knowledge should not be suppressed, either it's from indigenous or from the Western world. These are all or aesthetics of God. And nobody should kill the aesthetics of God or the way of creation of God. So they should be given a chance. But there are, of course, despite these challenges, there are these things we may call effective collaboration. So we may say that successful complementary partnerships will require community-led research. 2, cultural humility. 3, reciprocity. Now, when we talk about community-led research, we need to ensure indigenous communities retain ownership and control over their knowledge and the research process. No one should come from out there and dictate to these poor people, these, less people, less human people, or, those primitive people. That is not the way. We do not have primitive, because these jargons, primitive, less than human, or less people, relative. Who is less? What makes you big is what makes me small, or the other way around. Or what makes you small is what makes me big. What you devalue is what I value. What you consider primitive is what I consider modern or progressive. So those are the things to avoid in order to collaborate. This concerning cultural humility, adopting an approach that recognizes the limitations of one's own worldview and respects the expertise of the other. That's what we call cultural humility, rather than ethnocentrism, where you impose yourself, your ethnic standards, and you want to weigh everybody along that line. That's getting unfair to such people. Yes, that's dangerous. Another effective way of collaborating is through reciprocity. That is, moving beyond mere consultation to ensure that knowledge sharing is a mutual, respectful process that benefits both parties. So we go beyond mere consultation, mere, public show, mere utterances, but swing into action and employ reciprocity. That is give and take approach. Of course, there are common grounds between indigenous and Western. One is empirical observation. The other one is dynamic nature. And the other one is goal of sustainability. The other one is methodological overlap. So we can start by saying that both systems rely on careful, long-term observation of the environment, such as tracking animal behavior, weather patterns, or ecological challenges. That is what we call empirical observation. And that's a common ground. Another common ground is dynamic nature. Both IKS and Western knowledge or Western science are evolving, adaptive, and responsive to new information and changing conditions. Concerning the goal of sustainability as a common ground between Western versus indigenous, I should say, both approaches aim to solve environmental problems and promote ecological balance, such as in natural resource management. The other one is methodological overlap. Now, similar to scientific data collection, IKS involves learning by doing and passing down validated knowledge through generations. Okay? This is similar to scientific data collection. Okay? This is an overlap of sorts. Both systems are based on rigorous observation. There is nowhere people just make quick conclusions, like a poor judge who listens to one person and then you make a conclusion from the testimony of one man, one woman, one person. That is naive. That is That's a poor way of making a conclusion. You listen to all and listen again and again before you conclude. That is a rigorous observation. And both system, Western and indigenous methods are visible. Also experience, rigorous experience, and the need to solve practical problems. That is in both of them. Both seek to make predictions and forecasts, such as weather patterns or species behavior through as a methodological overlap. Both of them find themselves seeking or making predictions and forecasts such as weather patterns or species behavior. We have considered those differences such as epistemology and methodology, context versus universality. Okay, these are differences in approach, not necessarily differences. There's also horizon versus reductionism. There's values versus focus. There's concept of time and truth that may not necessarily be different, but there's differences in approach. Could be the same thing, but the approach changes. Contexts are also different. The Western concept one is different in terms of context and historicity of these people. Some were enslaved, some were what? Yes, some did not have First and Second World War. Of course, it came by extension to Africa, for example. Some fought seriously. Yeah, they had a reason to start the UN because the Union of World Bodies because of some experiences, others and the experiences from slavery, colonialism, and of course the epidemics and all that. There's also a difference in transmission. Some are done orally, some are done through controlled studies, some are lived experiences, orally done. Some always rely on written documentation. While Western knowledge excels in technology and data-driven analysis, indigenous knowledge offers crucial insights for sustainable long-term ecological management and holistic health. Increasingly, there is a call to bridge these systems through respectful ethical collaboration, such as using the metaphor of the two raw wampum, where both coexist without dominating one another. That is it. And of course, there are frameworks of collaboration, as we have noted earlier. The two-eyed seeing of Elder Marshall, Robert Marshall, the co-management or co-production is another framework for collaboration. There is also bridging, breeding, and weaving. Okay? A three-step framework that starts with building mutual respect, bridging, intertwines knowledge systems for comprehensive understanding, breeding, and applies indigenous methods alongside scientific ones. Weaving, that's weaving. There is also, as a framework for collaboration, there is also relational accountability, or the 5 R's. Okay, you talk of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, relationships, and redistribution. Ensuring that knowledge sharing is ethical and mutually beneficial. We talked about co-production of knowledge or co-management as a framework for collaboration, because these models involve collaboration from project inception, where indigenous people, practitioners, and scientists jointly define research questions, method, and solutions. For example, in conservation or environmental monitoring, there is also parallel independent methodologies. Sometimes, instead of blending, the best approach is to keep the system separate but parallel to maintain their integrity, such as mapping cultural sites independently before overlaying with scientific ecological data. Now, key principles for success in this framework of collaboration include mutual respect, equal partnership, addressing power dynamics, and also cultural safety. When all these things are taken in, we are likely to have a very perfect collaborative or a perfect collaborative world where knowledge systems are not fought but encouraged so that we can draw a conclusion or we can compare notes. And the end product, we have a global joy, and the joy to one becomes joy to all. And we become winners. All of us become winners. Let me see something else we have not considered so that we end it that far. Maybe unless we have more questions, we can stop it there. Thank you.